podcast is a quest for well-being, a quest for a meaningful life through the exploration of fundamental truth. Enlightening ideas, insights on physical, mental, and spiritual health. The inspiration is love. The aspiration is to awaken new ways of thinking that can lead us to a new way of being well. Welcome to Body, Mind, and Soul Healing Conversations.
The gift of life is a profound sense of well-being. We feel connected and vibrantly alive to the connection that we feel deep inside of ourselves and with everything. From this beautiful space, it is very difficult to be distracted by the mundane mind, because when we are in touch with this beautiful state, then it's almost as if we've clarified within the brain and the way that the brain functions, that there is no need to fall back into the mundane. There is no need to be distracted by the mundane, because we have said no, that we do not need this experience, because we have chosen to open up to the power of the heart within ourselves, rather than be constantly manipulated by thoughts. Then, when we open to the power of our heart, the practice is very profound. The practice of meditation is about a discovery of who we are, the truth of who we are. Tony Samara. In this episode, Valeria Tellis interviews Tony Samara about meditation and power of transmission. Tony Samara is a spiritual teacher and author of over a dozen books. He has been sharing deep evolutionary work and inspiring people to incorporate meditation into their daily lives for more than 25 years. Combining meditation, detoxing the body, a plant-based diet, and a simple lifestyle, he is best known for how his work touches more deeply than words. Here is the interview with Tony Samara.
In your own words, who is Tony Samara?
It's an interesting question because, it depends on the circumstances. If I'm being the husband to my wife or if I'm being the teacher, there are different aspects that Tony Samara sort of communicates. But in the end, for me personally, I feel that I am a channel or a bridge moving towards what I call the light. So I feel very much connected to the mystical tradition and being a teacher of mysticism and meditation, helping myself, of course, and everyone else around me to connect to what I believe to be a very beautiful aspect of life, which I call the light.
When did you realize that you were that channel of light?
Well, I'm told by my family that I was very unusual as a child. We're all unusual. We all have interesting sides. But I spoke about different realms of reality and what people would call today channeling, perhaps, like wisdoms, in a way that really wasn't normal for a 3-year-old. So this I don't remember very much of what I did because I was just doing what came naturally. But my parents were always, quite amazed at some of the things that I said or did. I realized from an early age that I was a little bit different. And it's not always a good thing. When you're a teenager, you don't want to be different from everyone else. You want to be the same. So, it wasn't all good, but it defined my personality and helps me to recognize that, we all have gifts that we can share, different gifts, which create a very beautiful world, and this is, I believe, my gift.
Wow. How do you understand and explain being the way you were as a child?
Well, I think that children are all gifted. I think we're born from a space of purity. And when you're a child, there is an innocence and there is a connection to various realms of reality that we lose touch with as we grow up and become social creatures, get manipulated by, specific belief systems in our culture and different ways of thinking, perhaps family constellations, perhaps just, situations around us mold us into something that's very different from the way children are. I'm not saying children are perfect, but there is an innocence that is perfect within their essence that I find very important, and I think this has been lost in the world today, because the world today is very complex, and we're very focused on survival, getting through all the complexities of what it means to be part of a modern society. And so, the creative, the playful, the direct connection to what some people call God, I call the light, is lost, and it's natural, if you're worrying and stressed and, busy with everyday type situations, it's not that easy to be like a child and, playful and creative and just live in the moment.
It's true. So true.
I wanted to say my intention for this podcast is exactly what you're speaking about, how to transmit this creative innocence that is deep within our souls in a way that's practical, easy to put into practice in everyday type situations. In this podcast, I'm hoping to share some of these wisdoms, if you don't mind. I just, create an intention. So, the mystics believe that it's really important to have an intention. This means a structure that defines how you focus your energies. And I was looking through a little bit of what I wrote, and there is a part in the Bible that speaks about this intention that I want to share with you. And it's from the King James Version of the Bible. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Now, when I read that, it's interesting, but it's very conceptual. So I translated that from the original Aramaic, which is the ancient language similar to Hebrew. And that creates, for me, the space to be more creative with that intention. And this is my translation, so it's a very creative type translation. It's not literal. And it goes like this: healthy and whole are those whose passions are touched by the deep, abiding and connected purpose that we all have within us. They shall regard and love the power that moves them and shows itself in all things of the cosmos. See, language and communication depends on your creativity. So in the end, you can create an intention like this by going a little bit further than the literal verse that I was reading in the beginning, and see how it applies to you in everyday type situations. So I just thought to share that with you because you're speaking about children, and I think children are pure in heart. And, this is my intention. How can we come back to this purity, but in a very spiritual, practical and mature way, rather than just, being childish in what people think being childish means, that just doing whatever comes to your mind and not really thinking about people around you and situations that are important.
I love that, Tony. Absolutely love that intention. Let's call it that. My next question is more general. What is life to you?
For me, life is about being of service to the divine, the light, in a very down-to-earth way. So doing whatever your heart tells you, but from this very deep and meaningful place. Just being kind. For me, being kind is really important. Being honest, communicating to people, getting in touch with the real in a person, and communicating from that real space, and just finding together, with whomever you're communicating to, with me, it's my family or my friends or the people I'm working with, finding a way to come back to this sense of sacredness and meaningfulness that is part of life. And for me, that's how I live my life, and how I've always lived my life since a very early age.
Right. What is the opposite of life?
The opposite of life, if you're speaking in a literal sense, is death. But I think many of us walk around and we haven't really come back to the knowledge of what it means to be alive. So, many are walking around really closed and perhaps feeling as if, that life has no purpose. So it's a type of death. And so that is the opposite of, living a vibrant, healthy, connected and spiritual life. So death for me is the lack that happens when we're very focused on materialism, very focused on egoic needs and wants, very focused on negativity and all the things that pulls humanity away from life. So for me, that's the death, because actually I believe after death there isn't really the pain and suffering that many of us have here when we're out of touch with our spiritual essence.
Right. Many believe that death means transformation, renewal.
I don't think we can really know until we go through the experience, which, that's the only real sort of answer I can give to that question. But, I've gone through, perhaps others have gone through this too, what is known as a death rebirth experience, which is, it's almost as if some part of you really experiences death, but you're not really physically dying. I was very sick as a child, so I did go through many physical situations that brought me close to death. So I think when you go through a death rebirth experience, you're more comfortable with the idea of death because it's very frightening for some people. But I don't know if death itself helps you to transform. I think what is really important is your attitude and your perception during that moment of death. And, that helps you to be connected either to what guides you towards the light, or if your mind is confused and in pain or suffering because of conflicts, then I think transformation isn't very easy during the transition period between life and death. I think then it's difficult. But, in the end, I don't think so much about these things because, it's all about life now and what you do in this moment. And death is just a reminder that everything is impermanent and not to get attached to, money or materialism because, it doesn't take you anywhere. It's helpful sometimes, but, in the end, it's your attitude and your feelings and your connection to the world that is more important. I practice non-attachment to the past and the future and bring most of my attention and my energy to this moment and the energy of this moment. So the flow, as some people call it.
Yeah. It's interesting when you say everything's happening now, the focus, attention is on what's happening here now. I'm just wondering why so many people have had the experience of those who talk a lot about communicating with spirit and angels, and so that's there for them.
That's also very difficult to speak about because I think everyone has their own unique connection to, say, people that they love, not only people, animals sometimes. And that connection can happen in so many different ways. I often dream of my grandparents, and it seems to me like in the dream there is some form of communication happening that's very difficult to sort of understand from a logical perspective, but there is some sort of communication that's still present in my life, and I can sense it. And I think, people who communicate to people who have passed away or animals that have passed away are communicating to the energy or the essence of the person. And that is a wonderful and unique experience. It depends on maybe the culture as to how you perceive that communication and your religious background maybe and your belief systems. But I think mostly we are connected to so many dimensions. I mean, Einstein spoke about this, and we live in a multidimensional reality. It's not as linear as our minds perceive things to be. So in this multidimensionality of experience, then we can connect to perhaps another dimension that is the place where you go to when you die. I don't know. In the end, I only know my truth, and I do really, I really believe that death is just a transition. So, but that's me. That's my experience. It doesn't really matter if I say that to someone if they're afraid of death and feel that that's the end. I also studied biology, so many of my friends are biologists, and they believe, after death, that's it. Your body dies, your brain dies, there's just memories left, Maybe they're right,
I love that, the openness, just, right. What is the mind and what are thoughts, Tony?
Yeah, the mind is a very tricky aspect of the thinking brain. If you look at it just from a biological perspective, then the mind is just your thoughts and your perceptions, or creating a sense of reality. But for me, the mind, perhaps similar to the Buddhists and the mystics, the mind is a very essential quality in our spiritual development. So the mind has, of course, its attachments to whatever, the world wants, needs, desires, but also the mind has a perception that connects us to wisdom. And it is this wisdom that, helps us to really sense what is going on in the world. So it's not so much about resolving problems, if you're in debt, how am I going to pay my mortgage? That's just the more superficial aspect of the mind. But there is a depth that connects you to inner wisdom and outer wisdom that creates what I call the spiritual or the universal mind. And we can get in touch with that through dreams. I often speak about that in some of the retreats, but also through parables and through intentions and creating a structure where there is this communication to a deeper aspect of your mind that is just not normal in the world today, because at school we're taught to think in a very simplistic way. We're simplistic meaning we learn mathematics, we learn how to read and write, we learn languages, we learn the basics of thinking, but we don't go deeper. At school at least, and so it's not very normal to understand that level of depth. But in certain cultures, that is more easy, and depends also at which time in history you live. So I know, like during the time in Persia, Rumi, for example, a wonderful poet, he spoke in ways that really made sense to many people. So you didn't have to be a poet to understand what he spoke about, because it was universal mind speaking wisdoms, and people just understood from their heart, that this was meaningful, what was being communicated. So that the mind is also a very beautiful aspect of humanity, it's sacred.
Wow, I'm wondering what happened and why have we changed living this reality more connected to the brain and not the heart?
Well, I think that we go through phases. History has helped us to get closer to the more creative universal mind. And then when evolution moves in a certain way, then the thinking mind and the problem-resolving mind tends to take over. So throughout our recent history, the Industrial Revolution and modern living, the way we live today, in a city, and that requires a very functional brain, and so we have to utilize the brain, to just adapt to the situations that we're living in now. It's very different than 500 years ago, So I think that's part of the reason, but also part of the reason is that we've forgotten. We've fallen asleep. I often say in retreats, we've fallen asleep, and there is a veil that prevents us from opening up to the portal of change. And it's almost as if we know we have to walk the spiritual path. And we know that our hearts, deep, deep, deep within, need to remember something, perhaps something from those ancient times when we were more connected, perhaps just the remembrance that falls into place when the heart is awakened, not through the brain, but through just the wisdom. I think that we're doing this, but there are lessons that we all have to learn. And some of them aren't very nice. And then it takes a little bit of time to get through those lessons, either individually or as a culture, and perhaps we're going through one of those lessons now. I do believe that this is going to be not a difficult time, but a time that requires a lot of consciousness, a lot of spirituality, and a lot of openness. Otherwise, there will be, a little bit of suffering and learning that has to happen so that we can open up in this way, and just be more receptive to not the negative mind, but the more positive in life, what can help us to come back to our hearts and wisdom.
Wow. I love the way you don't use the word becoming, because in a sense, we already are all there is, but you use the word remembering, right?
Yes.
That's great. What do you think is the world's greatest healing need?
I think we have to respect one another much more. And this, conflict, and perhaps it's, ancient also. It's, there have been wars for thousands of years, but this conflict that we're creating today, where we don't respect one another, we're all very individualized, and we think about our needs and sometimes our selfish and greedy needs, that is just not sustainable anymore. And I don't think people understand it. When I listen to politicians and certain people speak about, what's important, I just don't understand how they can't see what's going on, and all this talk of, people being, the reason as to why whatever problems that exist in the world exist, the Americans blaming certain people and the other people in the world, the Iranians or the wherever, North Koreans blaming the Americans. This sort of communication is just such a waste of time. And I just don't understand why energy is put into it, because we could really put energy into a deeper communication, a connection to one another, and that creates a lot of movement. I was reading the history of Spain, and my mum lives in Spain. I was reading, in Spain, in Andalusia, the southern part of Spain, there were all sorts of cultures, and at one point it was really a flourishing place where education and culture and new ways of perceiving the world, new theories, all came to light very quickly, and it was a very special place until all of a sudden there was a war between the different cultures and religions, the Jewish and the Muslims and the Christians. And in the end, war and disrespect will only lead to suffering, but for everyone. And I just hope that we can see through things. I know I've spoken to some of my friends, biologists, who were speaking about the extinction of insects, which apparently is a very big thing in biology at the moment. There's a bit of worry, the diversity that's happening. We know about the bees, but also many other insects. And they're worried that, we're not doing enough. And I think that would be, one of the reasons why I continue teaching and continue speaking like yourself, to the world, to try to engage people in a different way of thinking, not conflict and disrespect, but love and connection. And sometimes it's difficult because people can be very, very bad and very, very silly in the ways, in their ways, but in the end you have to forgive and accept, and that is the way forward, and rather than blame and disrespect others, find a way to connect to love, and for me that's important.
Very important. Yes, yes, and yes. What is love to you?
It depends. Again, it depends who I'm connecting to. But, because perhaps when speaking to someone is a respect and understanding that this person that's a wonderful being, full of potential and full of wisdom, And sometimes love could be just the stillness that is important when you listen to a person, but really listen to a person and you're present to a person. So love could be expressed as presence. Love can be a hug. Love can be just a connection, just a laugh together, or, sitting and enjoying a movie together, having a beautiful meal and enjoying the nurture that happens when you share a meal together. Love is so much. It's difficult to define into one little thing and say love is this. But perhaps, if you need to define it, love would be connection, the connection that we have within ourselves and also the connection we have with others and other situations around us.
Yes. So let's talk about meditation and the power of transmission. What is to meditate?
Well, meditation is a state of consciousness. A lot of people think meditation is about closing one's eyes, and, closing your eyes and then sitting there and doing nothing. Actually, right. Meditation is very, very difficult to learn because it's about emptying your mind of the stress and the anxiety that happens when you're attached to situations around you. So it's a letting go process. And the letting go process is almost, you could see it as the bridge that helps you to connect to a deeper state of consciousness that's similar to sleep, but it's very different, because you're awake. You're actually able to connect to what's going on in a very conscious way. So it's a state of consciousness. And for me, meditation can be divided into two: mindful type meditation, so it's a certain type of awareness, and deep meditation. So I teach both, but my focus is deep meditation.
Right. You speak of transmission in meditation, so I'm wondering what it means.
Well, that's what I did to start with. I spoke about the beautiful verse that helps us to connect to the purity of our hearts, to find a purpose in life. So transmission is what mystics have done throughout the ages, through words and sometimes beyond words. So through words, through parables and poetry, and just speaking in such a way that doesn't just engage the mind, but also engages the heart to open up and to receive. So transmission is this receptivity. And, if the person speaking isn't receptive, meaning that, not receptive to love and a connection, then, it's just words. But transmission is when I truly put myself in a situation where I'm totally open, totally vulnerable to everything, and speak from deep within my heart and transmit this energy to a person. I suppose it's like, if a parent hugs and smiles a child, there is just this vulnerability and giving yourself totally to that moment and totally to that situation. That is transmission. It's an energetic connection that goes also beyond words. So I do this also as a distant healing type thing through energy.
Yeah. You write about being close to the truth, or in alignment to the truth, or the presence of one's inner truth. What is the truth?
The truth to me is the light that shines within your heart. That is your purpose, what guides you in your deepest dreams to come back to remembering who you truly are. That's your truth. And it's impossible to say, what truth means to anyone, because it's a personal experience. It's a personal experience that you have with God or the divine or the sacred or the light within yourself. And that luminosity and that sacredness is expressed in a feeling or a sense that touches the very core of your being. So that for me is truth. And being in alignment to the truth means that you live your life in that way. So it's not enough to just have that feeling and that connection, because whatever you do outside, meaning the way that you live your life, the way that you communicate to people, the way that you two things has to match that inner realization, has to be in alignment to that inner realization. And, this means that very often we focus on different things. When we're in alignment with our truth, we focus on things that are meaningful and important. So we don't waste time. And this is what I feel that many people do when they're lost, when the alignment to inner truth isn't really there. People spend time drinking too much, taking drugs, perhaps wasting money and wasting time entertaining themselves. Now, that's not a judgment. If they could see, what do I choose to do with this time? What helps me to really feel blissful and happy when I make that conscious choice, then perhaps the choices would be different. And people often know this, if they're parents, they regret later on when the children grow up, regret that they didn't spend enough time with their children, quality time with their children, because everything was so busy, busy doing this, busy doing whatever. So if you're in alignment with your truth, you see things before it's too late. You don't get to the age of, say, 70, 80, 90 or whatever and think, oh, I wasted so much of my life, because you're in touch with your truth, and that's what's guiding you, rather than the superficial that sometimes manipulates us into being addicted to too much drink, too much food, too much money, too much this, too much that.
Wow. I'm wondering if we all understand, connect, and experience the truth differently.
Yeah, for sure. I traveled because my parents were diplomats. I traveled around and lived in different places. And it's interesting, every culture sees things a little bit differently. I think that's a gift, really, because it helps us to open up. I remember I studied in Australia for a few years. And I remember, in Australia, they speak English, but I remember saying a few things and then understanding that even though I was using the same words in English, that in Australia it meant something totally different. And then also I had to learn Spanish when I was in South America. And I remember just thinking, gosh, it's not so easy to learn a language, because you really have to understand a culture to learn the language. And, our perception of reality and truth is filtered through the way that we communicate. And, we are all very different, but it's so wonderful. I find it so exciting to learn things from other people, whether they be Japanese or Chinese or South American or, European, we're African. There are so many gifts that you can realize when you're present to the learning that happens when, people communicate from an open space.
Right. And that might just be the gift and the play of creativity, all these different expressions of the same thing.
Wouldn't it be boring if we're all the same, like lived in a very rigid, regimented sort of way,
Yes. Yeah, I agree. Well, it's wonderful. Yeah, it's a wonderful dance, isn't it? What would this relative reality be like if everyone was living in this space of truth?
I think the world would be a much easier place to sort of exist in. And, if everyone listens to the depth of their hearts, then we would definitely shift to a higher frequency, which in a practical sense, what it means, we wouldn't be caught in this sort of survival mode that our culture and humanity has evolved within. There is this situation that is called the negative bias, which means that the brain, focuses on problems, but that's part of our evolution. And it's an important part of our evolution because the frequency that we live in is basically about survival and has been about survival. It's only now do we have the possibility to a certain degree to perhaps change that. If we were able to consciously choose to move beyond the suffering and to be in alignment to the abundance that is possible, I think on a biological level, our genes would express themselves differently. We wouldn't really need to survive anymore. We'd be at another level. We would be enjoying the experience much more, and the worry and the stress and the negative bias would be less actual, because we would move beyond survival and be in a state of abundance and receptivity. And I think that's what the shift is about, but it takes time.
Yeah. And that leads to my next question about trust. You wrote in The Power of Transmission, the trust that is required to be present to the truth is the trust that you are not your mind, you're not your feelings, and you're not your body. What does it take for a person to arrive at this state of trust? But before that, even, what does it take to someone to even desire to get to this state?
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah. Because without that motivation of wanting to awaken, then we can be asleep for a very long time. And for some people, that awakening happens through suffering. In shamanism, for example, this is known as the wounded healer, because you have to work through your pain and work through the suffering. You open up to the awakening of compassion and awakening of just being a healer. But, we're not really needing to function on that level. Most of us, we don't need to choose suffering to be free. But I'm just saying this in case, there is anyone suffering, to know that, there is a positive possible outcome from that suffering. I was listening to these Jewish twins who lived through the Holocaust, and terrible suffering. I mean, unbelievable when you think about it. But I listened to her communicate, and she had such wisdom and such compassion and such acceptance of horrific type situations, and forgave all the people who caused her family and herself and her twin sister such pain. I think that's possible. But for most of us, there are some steps, some practical steps. Most of us don't have to suffer to that degree. But if we do, I think we're guided by the light. We're guided by the angels. We're guided by the wisdom within. So, never to despair, to always really trust. I can share with you 4 steps that are important to connect to and to awaken within oneself. And the first is to really listen to one's heart. That, if you don't listen to your heart, if you listen to your mind, it's very difficult to trust your mind, because your mind is just too much of a monkey,
True.
Yeah, we'll jump all over the place and really never help you in the same way as your heart. Your heart, I'm not talking about the emotional heart, I'm talking about, the deep heart. And to listen to that means to go beyond the thinking mind and beyond the emotional aspect of yourself, to find stillness. So trust comes from that stillness that happens when you listen to your heart, when you just take a moment and think, okay, what is important? You can do this either through meditation, you can do this through praying, you can do this through going for a walk in nature. In Japan, they have this wonderful thing called forest baths, where they walk in nature just to integrate and listen and to come back to heart rather than to be too attached to the mind. So that's a very important aspect of what I call the transformation. The other is spiritual work that awakens the pineal gland. Now, pineal gland I call the master gland in our bodies, that helps us to connect to the spiritual realm. Because we could be very in touch with lots of things, but if the pineal gland is not functioning in a certain way, then everything becomes too intellectual. So it's almost like the difference between someone who studies mysticism and someone who practices mysticism. The pineal gland, the activation of the pineal gland will help to open up what some people call the third eye, which is basically intuition. You become sensitive to reality, and you begin to trust other things, your dreams. You begin to trust the signs that appear out of nowhere, the people that you meet that guide you to move in a certain direction, that then helps you in an incredible way that you couldn't have ever thought of before. So this awakening of intuition, this awakening of the pineal gland, I believe to be, super important. And the third is awareness, just be aware of what's going on. Be aware of people, be aware of situations, what you're doing, what you put yourself through, how you think about yourself, how you think about other people. Awareness is what some people call mindfulness, is really the ability to choose and to have that freedom of choice, so that you can be empowered by awareness rather than fall into just reactions and fall into just repeating belief systems because they're there and you've embodied them. So awareness is a type of freedom that most of us don't really explore enough. But if we have the courage to trust that freedom, then, we will do things very differently, for sure. That's also a rebirth of our consciousness. So that's 3 things. And then the last thing is creativity. And I think this is super important. Play. Be creative, spend time listening to music, walk in nature, just be creative in the way that you do things. Sometimes some of the teachings in retreats, are very practical. Like instead of walking, if you normally walk, say, with your right foot leading your walk, then use your left foot, or perhaps try writing with your left hand, or try brushing your teeth with your left hand. Like, be creative in the way that you connect to reality, so that you can begin to be sensitive enough to get in touch with the spiritual realms, which that's where trust really happens. Because as you said, we're more than our mind, we're more than our thoughts, we're more than our feelings, we're something, but we don't remember. And that remembrance comes from trust.
Wow, Tony, that's wonderful. I have 3 questions for you. One is, how do we overcome this fear of not being the mind, not being the feelings, and not being the body?
Yeah, and it's easier said than done. It's very difficult, when your whole identity depends on, certain thoughts and certain feelings and certain ways of connecting to the world, to just let it go. It's a process. It doesn't happen overnight. And this is why sometimes reading books is a little bit of a distraction, because you read the book and then you want to get there before doing the work. And I often remind people that, it's a step-by-step process. You have to actually take the steps. You can't jump. Sometimes by the grace of God or the grace of the light, you are carried, so the steps are easier. But in the end, those steps for most people are important. And I think it's a slow process of detachment. So if you, for example, identify with fear, many people do, I'm too afraid to do this because otherwise, and then they think of all the problems, which is, the negative bias. If that is really a core part of yourself, you can't just let it go. It's dangerous to just let it go, actually. You have to work through it. And first you have to find what you can trust that goes beyond the letting go of fear. You have to trust something. So, for me, trusting means trusting your essence, trusting your light. And so, when you begin to trust the light, that carries you, that helps you to take the next step. And then the process begins to move by itself, because there is an excitement and there is a flow which is more interesting than fear for the mind. The mind is very attached to fear. So if you don't do it in this way, the mind will constantly say, oh, but what if? But if you begin to trust the light within yourself and consciousness, then you see that there are other possibilities. So, this is what I call giving yourself to the spiritual realm, giving yourself to the spiritual light, where your focus is just the work, the work of transformation rather than what is holding you back. And so then you can slowly let go of fear. In practical ways, this means, you just experiment with changing your life in certain ways, So if, for example, you're doing something that you hate doing, if you work and you hate your work, it's easy to say, just leave it, just do something else. But if everything depends on your work and your house and your children depend on you and your family and whomever, it's easier said than done. It's a process. You have to choose, okay, do I truly believe that I'm worth something? And how do I measure that worth in a material sense? And then you can begin to, confront those fearful old belief systems that are holding you back. And that's the step-by-step process that, happens during retreats or during some of the online courses that I do. It's a process that's you get guidance as to how to do this, because it's very, very difficult for everyone. Fear is a major aspect of our being, and we evolved to fear whatever, the saber-toothed tiger, out there. We are afraid of the saber-toothed tiger. Otherwise, we would just walk into the forest and think we're okay, but, we wouldn't be okay. So fear has a biological reason and it's important. But when it comes to our attitude towards ourselves and the world, fear can really be very damaging. So it's a process, it's a step-by-step process.
And it is, yeah. I really support the idea of compassion and kindness, treating ourselves with kindness, not trying to accomplish something fast that would be unkind. And I also love the way you explained that about our dependencies, that there's almost like a cycle. Fear, attachment to structures. It could be mental, emotional, physical, and then suffering, and then the cycle just continues. And the opposite of that, let's say, which I don't think is the opposite, it might be just the balance or returning, going back to what is. It's trust in the heart, right? I love that. So you mentioned also intuition. I'm wondering, how do we know when we are listening to our intuition and when we are listening to our beliefs?
Yeah, that's a good question, because many people confuse desire and want with intuition. My intuition is saying that I should do this, or I should get this, I should buy myself this holiday or whatever. But actually, intuition isn't a want and isn't a need. Intuition for me is the communication that happens in the higher realms of consciousness. And that communication then is filtered down as a symbol or as a sensation or as a tingling sometimes for me. My body tingles when I know something is right. There is an excitement that I can't really understand in that moment, but I know something, my intuition is working. For different people, it's different, but it's the higher realms of consciousness, connecting to the mundane world in a way that's understandable. So very often, most of our intuition will happen in dreams. When we're asleep, when we're dreaming, in REM sleep, our brains are so open to the higher realms of consciousness that we will dream. And it's not that, everything in the dream is literal, but it's a symbol or an aspect of yourself that's saying something that is inviting you to come back to your intuition. And when you honor that, when you listen to it, when you write it down, when you do it, then intuition becomes more present in what happens in your life, And so, yeah, intuition is difficult because, people very often confuse the subtle with intuition, but intuition can be very black and white, can be very, very real. I remember my intuition saying, I have to travel back. I need to. I was living in New Zealand at the time, and I need to go back to Europe. And live in Europe, in the UK and outside of the UK. And so many things happened because I listened to the intuition. And, it wasn't subtle. It was, I couldn't relax. I really knew I had to travel. And that's intuition, it's something there that keeps coming up and saying, you need to do this. You can't just ignore. And if you ignore, it will come up and show itself in different ways.
Right.
Someone you or something will happen to tell you that, no, you've got to follow your dream. You've got to follow your intuition. You've got to follow your heart, And I think that's how the cosmos speaks to humanity, basically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like the way you use the words need, have connected to intuition, and then should connected to beliefs. And you also mentioned choice, that we have the choice to listen to the heart or to be more in alignment with the truth. And I'm also wondering, how do we know when we are choosing and not trying to control the experience?
Yeah, if we try to find a better way or like a nicer outcome to a situation. Very often, that's the ego mind falling into a picture that may be comfortable, may be understandable because of past experience, but it's not always, what really needs to happen. So freedom of choice is about being receptive, receptive enough to just be present to what is being communicated. And very often you can create a structure so that the communication makes more sense. Because, when it comes to subtlety, it's very difficult to know, is this really being communicated, or is it my imagination? Is it my intuition? Is it my want? Is it my need? And I often say, if you're right-handed, place your hand upon your heart and just ask your heart to give you a sign, but not immediately. Usually just a sign as to this is the right way forward. So, say leaving a job, instead of thinking, is it good for me? Is it bad for me? What am I going to do if I leave my job? Just listen to your heart. Your heart is closer to the intuitive realm than your brain. So, the freedom of choice is easier within the heartfelt space that intuition communicates through than trying to receive that intuition through, the conceptual thinking that is the usual way that we try to understand intuition. And meditation helps the heart to open up in this way. And this is why meditation for me is so important, because, when you meditate and when you practice meditation, then you're channeling intuition, which is your higher self speaking to you, which is an incredible thing. Why would you not do that? If you want to listen to your intuition and listen to your higher self communicate wisdoms to you, that's something that would be useful to put into practice.
Yeah, very useful. And I have two more questions about trust. One is, so is trust connected to acceptance? And also, if trusting the truth is a practice?
Trust is very much about accepting and forgiving. Those are two things that I believe to be very important. I was speaking about the Jewish twins, and that's what she realized after so many years of suffering, that it's better to put the energy into forgiveness and acceptance. And, that's easier said than done, when you go through what they went through, and when people go through the suffering that happens here in the world, it's very difficult to open up to trust and to forgiving and accepting people and situations and yourself. But that is truly, truly important. I think also that gratitude is an aspect that is very helpful. Very often it's easier to look at the world and think about all the problems that you're facing and try to resolve all those problems. But just spending a few moments in gratitude and just thanking yourself and thanking the depth of your being for a beautiful experience that you really enjoyed. And it can be a very simple experience that helps you to then trust that there is a balance in the world. And if we focus too much on the negative, then that balance is lost. And it's very difficult to trust, and it's very difficult to live a spiritual life, because if you're sensitive, then you're sensitive also to all that's happening around you. And if you're sensitive and you listen to the news, or you see things that create a lack of positive hope, then, it's very difficult. And this is why I say gratitude is really an important practice to incorporate within meditation as part of the trust too.
Yeah, it makes so much sense to me. Coming to my final questions, I love the way you describe awakening. You say it is a wordless experience of being. Would you also say that awakening is the non-attached human experience?
Yeah, for me, awakening is the remembrance of love, the remembrance of a pure heart, the remembrance that you're much more than just your mundane thoughts and your mundane feelings. So awakening to love or awakening to consciousness is a form of detachment. On some level, it's a form of detachment that helps you to look more deeply into what it means to be a human being. It is a form of detachment. I know the Buddhists speak a lot about, detachment, and I think that's because of meditation. When you sit in meditation, you realize everything contains energy, and you choose, do you want to stay attached to certain energies, or, do you let them go? And in your mind, everything is equal, so you can focus on positive or negative. In life, sometimes the practical is not as easy, but, so detachment in life sometimes is difficult. If you go to work and someone is bullying you or teasing you, it's not that easy to be detached. But in your mind, you can detach from that picture, and it's easy in meditation to just let it go. And too many people, are attached to the pain that they tightly hold on to. And in everyday sort of situations, they speak to their friends, oh, my boss was really such a bully. And then, it's not enough to communicate, the pain. One person that, goes on and on, and, it becomes a negative that's attached to your brain. And it's a waste of time, really. In the end, it's not helping you at all.
Right. One of the things that I'm fascinated, it's with this idea of non-attachment to mind, feelings, body, but that's connected also to the experience of attachment, such as you mentioned before, enjoyment. In order to enjoy something, we've got to be attached to something. And then grief, purpose, longing, all this. Isn't it everything connected to divine, to that we can't really put into words?
I understand what you're saying. And perhaps, what you said previously, it's all about balance. The state of equilibrium and resilience that happens when you accept and forgive and you're just open to the experience. That means you are in the flow and enjoying whatever is happening. Of course you can't enjoy pain, but you enjoy life. You're alive. You're awakened to something much more than what you're sensing, because really in the end, I've never watched the movie The Matrix, but it's a bit like that, I would say, from what people have told me. Life is such an illusion, and if we're attached to just parts of our experience, then there isn't equilibrium in the way that we're flowing through life, and we can get very stuck for a very long time, and that limits our spiritual progress and our spiritual awakening. But when we come to balance, when we come back to a state of balance, then yes, you are attached to joy, you are attached to the people that you love, but that's good. You don't want to be cold and detached from everything. You want to be like the divine, part of everything.
Right, because we are life.
Yes.
We're not separate from life.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's interesting the way you're saying. I never heard it that way before. In a way, attachment, then it's just this identification with parts of life, just holding on to parts of life. So my final questions. If you knew you would lose the body soon, would you change anything?
No, I don't think so. I'm living my life just with the understanding that tomorrow is not guaranteed. So I live for today, I do everything. Really, this has been my practice since the age of 17, 18. Some people say it's irresponsible because, you have to plan for your future and you have to think about whatever. But you can do both, But really, the focus in my life is just now, what's happening now with people around me, with situations around me, and what can I do with my time and my energy. So I don't think I would change anything. I mean, of course, if possible, I'd like to change some things in the past, but, as things are now, no, not at all.
Wow, that's wonderful. Embracing life as it goes, moment by moment. I know you said tomorrow and today, but the way I understand is just the next second, really. Yeah, that's a gift.
Yeah, I would like to actually offer a gift to, I know we're slowly coming towards the end. Time flies. But I wanted to offer, a free booklet to everyone. And you spoke about it, called The Power of Transmission. I don't know if maybe your listeners may be interested in reading this book. If they are, they can just write to me. I can be found on the website tonysamara.com. If you go to tonysamara.com/the power of transmission, there is a free link to download the booklet. Just to go deeper into what you were saying, I've written a few interesting things, and it's an easy way to put the power of transmission into practice.
Yeah, and that's a wonderful ebook. Yes. Well, I'll have the link on your profile, and that will be mentioned as well. So my last question, I guess you already answered my last question. This is second to last, was about where can we find more information on my script. So what are 3 things about life you know for sure as of now?
Well, I know that I love working with people. I love sharing this knowledge with people, and I've been doing this for decades, and it's just such a joy. I know that I love nature. I love the mountains, the sea, and I know that the most important aspect of life is the spiritual path, and I'm so happy to have found it early in my life, and that I continue to be inspired by others who practice spirituality, and also by the knowledge that I've received throughout these years.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your presence, Tony.
Thank you.
I'll talk to you soon. Bye for now.
Thank you for listening. To learn more about Tony Samara, please visit his website, tonysamara.com.
To learn more about this podcast, please visit fitforjoy.org/podcast. I want to thank the Patreon members, Lawrence McGrath, Mark Basden, Terry Clayton, and Aidan Bickrock. Thank you again for listening, and bye for now.